After a back-and-forth main event in Mexico City, the interim champ is now the undisputed baddest man on the planet. Welcome in to MMA Live Extra. I'm Phil Murphy. Fabricio Werdum submitted Cain Velasquez to unify the UFC heavyweight titles at UFC 188. For more, let's bring in our ESPN MMA writer, Brett Okamoto from Las Vegas. Brett, you were cage-side in Mexico City. What was your biggest takeaway from this fight?
Well, I think first and foremost, I was impressed by Fabricio Werdum, and I've been being impressed by this guy really for the last 6 years as he's gone on this run, which has ended in him being able to call himself the best heavyweight in the world right now. I thought that he was prepared for this fight so well, mentally and technically prepared for the pressure that Cain Velasquez was going to bring, physically prepared for the elements of Mexico City, fighting at elevation. That did not seem to have an effect on him. So world-class performance by Fabricio Werdum. And on the other side of that, giving Werdum all of his credit, but recognizing that this was not Cain Velasquez as we know him. This was not the same guy who we've seen dominate the division over the last 3-4 years. This was a guy who was coming off of a 600-day layoff. I didn't think it was going to affect him as much as it did, but clearly to me that layoff did have an effect on this performance, on this result. As I mentioned, this was just not Cain Velasquez at his best in Mexico City.
Brett, you briefly touched on the elevation. There was a lot of discussion regarding the altitude both before and after the event. In your mind, how much of a factor did that play in Cain's performance?
You know, in reality, I think it had a factor on everybody's performance, start to finish on that card, except for the fights that ended within the first minute. You could see the effects the elevation was having. And guys who don't typically gas, Gilbert Melendez very visibly hit a wall in the co-main event against Eddie Alvarez. Dana White said that at least 6 guys were losing their lunch and backstage throwing up after their fights because of that elevation. That's something you just don't see every day. Guys with their hands on their hips. So elevation played a role in a lot of fights on Saturday. It definitely played a role in the main event. However, I don't think you can say that is the reason why the belt is around Fabricio Werdum's waist come Monday morning. Like I said, you have to give credit for Werdum. He was completely prepared, and part of that was preparation for the elevation. This guy went down and spent more than a month in Mexico acclimating himself to that. Cain Velasquez, just 2 weeks. That might have been a mistake, but ultimately it was a small factor, one of the factors among many, and Fabricio Werdum title.
Yeah, Werdum spent more than a month at Campo Cresiba, the elevation there over 10,000 feet. Brett, at the post-fight press conference, UFC President Dana White was open to multiple options for who gets the first crack at the new champ Werdum. Who do you think should fight next for the title in the heavyweight division?
Yeah, well, I agree with President Dana White. There are a lot of options now at the top of that heavyweight division for Fabricio Werdum. You have Andre Arlovski, you have Junior Dos Santos, you have Stipe Miocic. Really, any one of those 3 could fit in as a #1 contender. You could build a case for each of them. But here's the way I look at it. None of those guys have really separated themselves completely from the pack. And look how long they've had to do it. Cain Velasquez hasn't fought since October of 2013. That was a very long window, a very long opportunity for one of these guys to put together a win streak and really claim that #1 contender spot, and none of them did it. So to me, that means there really is not an obvious #1 contender. So I'm inclined to give the opportunity right back to Cain Velasquez. I know that there is a need to move this division on. People are sick of the Velasquez-Werdum fight. We've been waiting for it for a long time already. But Velasquez, to me, is the most deserving. You look at his track record, you look at what he's done throughout his career. I think he deserves the shot. And I would be interested to see how he would fare facing Werdum again, this time not off of a 600-day layoff.
Certainly a lot of options on the menu for Joe Silva. Brett, you touched on the co-main event a moment ago. Eddie Alvarez beats Gilbert Melendez via split decision. You said last week previewing this fight, Eddie needed the win more. What does this fight mean now for both fighters going forward?
You know, it's interesting because I think short term it doesn't mean a whole lot. You look at where they were ranked coming into this fight, where they're going to be ranked coming out. Not a lot of movement. Eddie Alvarez is going to remain sort of around the 5, 6, 7 rank that he was going in. Gilbert Melendez, he'll slip a little bit, but I still think he's a top 10 guy, despite the fact he's 1-3 in his last 4 fights, which is pretty amazing when you say it out loud. But I think what the difference here is long term. It means a lot. You know, Eddie Alvarez can now look back on his career someday and say, I got that split decision win over Gilbert Melendez. That's an important win. It's a significant win, and it's one that, in a scheme of things on his resume, that's a pretty big feather in his cap.
He is ESPN MMA writer Brett Okamoto. Brett, we appreciate the insight, and that'll do it for this edition of MMA Live Extra. For Brett Okamoto, I'm Phil Murphy. Thanks for watching.